I love this question that we're asking. What is God really like? What is God really like? That's a question that I think all of us at different points in life try to answer. I want to tell you a quick story before I jump into that question, though, because I think this will set up a little bit about what we're talking about today. Our 10-year-old boy, a couple of years ago, he wanted a drone for Christmas, which threw me off a little bit, I got to be honest with you. I was like, how about like a BB gun or some Legos or something, you know? Like, what kind of kid wants a drone? But that's very common these days. Kids want drones. And so they sell drones fairly inexpensively. They're not even that crazy to be able to buy one. But my wife and I weren't going to buy one, and so we did what all parents do when you have a gift that you want to get for your kid, but you're not going to buy it. We told the in-laws about it. And so they bought him a drone. So they come in town for Christmas, and my father-in-law gives him all gifts and everything, and he opens up his drone. He's thrilled. He was about 8 at the time. And I said, hey, let's go to the school around the corner to their big open field, kind of like right out here in the high school, and let's fly this thing. Let's see what this thing can do. And so our 8-year-old son is very, he's responsible for an 8-year-old, which I really appreciate about him. And he's very careful with it and very, tentative. I said, hey, let me see that thing. I grabbed the controls. I said, let's see what this thing can really do, Let's take the top off of it and see how high it can really go. As you can already see in this story, that was a bad move. So it starts getting higher and higher, and I was pretty amazed. It was kind of a gray day. It was pretty windy that day. And the higher it got, the more I lost the ability to figure out, was it coming closer to me or was it going further away from me? That my depth perception was failing me. And so it gets higher and higher. Now the wind's blowing, and I feel like it's blowing it away, and I don't really know how to fly this thing. And so I'm trying to steer it, but I'm going, am I steering it back toward me, or am I pushing it further away, or is this the wind? I couldn't really tell. And within about 15 seconds, we could no longer see the drone. It had eclipsed the tree line, and it was just gone. So my father-in-law looks at me with that look again, like, I can't believe I let you marry my daughter, let alone I can't believe I let you parent these grandkids that we have. And I just took the remote. We all kind of packed everything up, and we just walked back home. And that was it. It was such a depressing, there haven't been many days where I felt worse as a dad. That feeling of being lost, that feeling of it's gone, it's so far gone that it can't even come back because of how far away it is. That's a feeling that we all know really well. In that moment, I felt the anger of my father-in-law. He's a really wonderful man, but I definitely felt like, is he frustrated at me? Is he mad at me? And that's a question we want to answer today is, what do we do if we feel like God is mad at us? Have you ever wondered that? Have you ever been concerned about that? Have you ever been curious about that? Could God really be mad at me? Some of you maybe grew up in a church where God's favorite word was no. Did anybody feel this way? The church I grew up in, anything you wanted to do, they were running in church, chewing gum in church, having a conversation in church, the answer was no. And because that was the answer in church, you just walk out of there going, well, I guess that's just who God is, that God is just a God of no. That's his answer for everything, no. And he just seems kind of frustrated, kind of grumpy, or kind of a killjoy, somebody that's trying to take away our fun or take away things that we might want to do. And for some of us, that causes us to run away. This is so important. This series is so important because how we think about God, how we think about who God is and what he's like, it matters so deeply, right? How we think about God matters because ultimately it will determine who we are, it will determine how we act, and it will also determine what we become. It matters so deeply in every aspect of life. Chris said it so well in between those two songs. He said, look, if we think that God is the kind of God that only likes the rich or the powerful or the good, then naturally we become people that only like the rich and the powerful and the good. Or if we think that God prioritizes certain groups of people over others, then we naturally do the same thing. Because how we think about God informs everything that we do. It informs how we treat other people. It informs how we think about ourselves. It informs how we deal with the people in our lives. It informs the way we handle problems that come to us, or even success that comes to us. And what I've found, what I'm sure you've experienced this as well, is it's really hard to get life right when we've got God wrong. It's hard to figure out this life. It's hard to get this life right when we've got God wrong. And so what we end up doing is the misperceptions that we have of God, it eventually creeps its way, filters its way into the way we think about ourselves. So what I want to do today is I want to try to answer this question. Well, is God mad at me? And if he is, what do I do? And if I've chosen to run away, if I feel like I'm lost, if I feel like he's frustrated at me, what do I do? I was really grateful when Ryan and I had this conversation about this series, because I just thought this idea was such a great idea to spend a couple weeks talking about what God is like. And I said, hey, would it be okay if I talked about this parable out of Luke 15? He said, absolutely, which I was just so thrilled by, because this is a very famous parable. It's one that people have heard before. You've probably heard it before. Y'all probably even talked about it here, but every time I read it, I feel like God uses it in my life. I feel like I get something out of it. So if you have a Bible, you can turn to Luke 15, or if you're using your device, you can turn to Luke 15, and we're going to look at this parable. There's actually 3 parables in Luke 15, and all 3 parables is Jesus, as Ryan called him last week out of Colossians, the image of the invisible God. That if we want to know what God's like, we look at Jesus. And so Jesus is trying to explain to us, well, what is God really like? And he uses these parables to do it. Now, you've read parables before. Those of you who've been around church, those of you who haven't, you're going to love parables. Parables are made-up stories with truth that matters, that means something. So even that word parable, the word parable, the word para means alongside of. The word bello or balo means to throw. So what Jesus would do is he would tell this story, and everybody would be engaged with the story, and then he would throw truth alongside the story. And in this particular parable, he's teaching us what God is really like. You've heard it before. It goes like this, Luke 15, verse 11. Jesus continued after he had told these 2 previous parables. He said, now, there was a man who had 2 sons. This parable is known as the parable of the prodigal son, but it's really, it would be better named the parable of the man who had 2 sons, because this is the way Jesus introduces it. Or really, honestly, the story is really about how great the father is. So it really could be named the parable of the amazing father. But we know it is the parable of the prodigal son because the prodigal son gets all the attention in this story. If we had more time, we would spend more time on the older brother, who's kind of the third scene of this parable. But today we're just going to focus on the first 2 scenes, primarily around the prodigal son, because the prodigal son was feeling something in his life. He had a misconception, a misperception of who the father was, and it caused him to live a certain way. It slowed him down. It became an obstacle. It became a distraction for him eventually. And then he fortunately gets over it and realizes who the father is. This is verse 12. Jesus continues and says, so the younger son says to his father, Father, will you give me my share of the estate? You can't imagine saying this to a loving father or even an unloving father. This would be a very bold, very audacious thing to say. I mean, what is he essentially saying? He's saying, Dad, you've been great. Thank you. You've done some nice things for us. But I would just prefer that you were dead. I would just rather you not be alive anymore. Because what I want out of you is what you have and not who you are. I mean, what an insulting thing to say to a parent, right? But this father was a loving father. This father was a father who was a successful father. He was a father who still loved his kids enough to let them live in the home, even though they were grown adults. That's pretty remarkable. And this loving father divided his property between them. He splits up the property. Says, all right, well, this is the older brother's. We'll put this over here until I die, when normal people would give it to him. And then for you, though, I'll go ahead and give you your share of the estate. And so not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, and he decides to leave. He sets out, Jesus tells us, for a foreign land, for a distant land. He wants to get far away from his family. He wants to maybe make a name for himself. He wants to go experience life in the way that he hadn't as he was growing up. And while he was there, Jesus fast forwards through, had to have been a lot of the details of what happened to this younger son, but over the course of events, over the course of weeks, of months, of years, we don't know how long, but eventually he squanders all of the wealth. Some of you, you went off to college and your parents gave you a certain amount of money, and you know what it's like to squander the money, right? I remember being a freshman in college. My parents had given me a little bit of money, and then I had money that I had worked. I had a lawn care company called Lover's Lawn Care. We cut what you hate. And I had built a good bit of wealth, like, $1,500, $3,000, something like that. It felt like a massive amount of money for me. And I moved off to Atlanta, Georgia, where I went to college at a school in Atlanta called Georgia Tech. And it didn't take me long to squander all the money. And then you look back on what you spent it on, and you don't even know what you spent it on, right? It's like Taco Bell and Wendy's, and that's pretty much it, And then it's all gone all of a sudden. You're going like, oh no, what am I going to do? Well, he had this experience. He had squandered it. He had squandered this money. He had squandered the money with wild living, with lavish living, with terrible decisions. After he had spent everything, then this is the way life happens, right? That sometimes the decisions that we make intersect with some really difficult circumstances in life and make everything harder. And so unfortunately, in his case, after he had spent everything, now there's a severe famine in the whole country. And all of a sudden, his need, the need to eat, the need for safety, the need for shelter, became something that he couldn't afford anymore. Sure, he had made some bad choices, but he also bumped into some really difficult circumstances. And he finds himself in a rough spot. He finds himself in a spot where the only thing he knew to do was to try to go get a job anywhere he could. He didn't have a great resume, though. People would say, well, let me see your resume. And he's like, I don't really have one. They're like, what have you been doing? He's like, squandering my father's wealth. They're like, well, that doesn't really set you up to do anything. He's like, no, I know. That's why I'm here. And he asks this particular owner, he says, hey, would it be possible if I just feed the pigs? I know how to do that. I used to do that as a kid. My dad owned some pigs, and I know how to do that. And so he went out and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his field to feed pigs. And then Jesus wants us to feel the depth of his pain, to feel the depth of his need. And so he includes this detail, which I find it really tells you where this guy was. Luke 15, verse 16, Jesus says, he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating. So basically, the pig's food seemed appetizing to him. But even then, no one gave him anything. They're going, no, this is for the pigs. You can't even have this. We're going to jump back in the story in just a second, but I just want to ask you this question, because this had to be a question that he had to run through his mind over and over again as he was out there feeding those pigs. Why do all of us have a tendency to run? Why do we have a tendency to run from God? Maybe you're in a place where you're currently running from God. And that can look like so many different things. Maybe you feel distant from God. Maybe the last year and a half has been really tragic, really hard, really difficult for you circumstantially, as it has been for so many people. And maybe you just are kind of grumpy. You're kind of frustrated. And so you wouldn't say you're running from God. You're not off in a distant land squandering wealth. You're just kind of mad and kind of frustrated. Maybe you're discouraged. Maybe you feel like, you know what, this has been really hard. And I don't feel like God has been aware of how hard this is. Or maybe, like so many people before, maybe you just feel like, you know what, I just want to go sow my wild oats. I just want to go see what life can do. I just want to go experience what seems like everybody else gets to experience. I remember being in college when I first was really up close and personal to what the church I grew up in always called sin You familiar with sin? I mean, it was the first time I'd ever really seen like sin in full action. I'm out by myself, out like on my own and hanging out. I joined a fraternity in college, and so I was like, man, this seems like it's going to be a lot of fun. And the more I realized how fun sin was, the more attractive sin was. I mean, sin is this idea that we use in the church. It's really a Bible word of that those things we do that miss the mark. They're not of God. They're putting ourselves first, or living in such a way that might hurt other people or may even hurt ourselves. God, that breaks his heart. That bothers him, like any parent, like any great father would feel. But the thing that sometimes we overlook is the fact that sin really is fun. And maybe you've decided to run, or maybe you've been in a season, or maybe you have a kid who's running because it's just fun. Or maybe you're just bored. Maybe you just hit that point in life where you kind of looking around going like, is this it? Is this everything? And maybe you're just bored. Or maybe it's because we think we can't make it on the straight and narrow. Have you ever noticed that sometimes people run because they just don't feel like they can do it? They feel like God has called us to live on the straight and narrow, this path that's for all the righteous people, all the holy people, all the good people. And sometimes we look at that road and we think, I don't know that I can do that. It feels like a lot of pressure. And maybe you've got a dad who wasn't able to do it. Maybe you got a mom who wasn't able to do it. So they just kind of checked out, because sometimes it's easier to just not try than it is to try and then to fail. Or sometimes, and this is what we want to talk about today, is sometimes people decide to run because we think that God's mad at us. That he's frustrated at something you did in your past, or frustrated about something that's been happening in the background of life. Think that he's got to be grumpy toward us because we just don't live the way, we don't consistently live the way he would want us to live. And I would imagine for this son that there was probably some of that was wrapped up in all this. He had this older brother that was like the perfect older brother. I don't know if you don't have to raise your hand, lest your older brother be in here, or older sister, but anybody have a firstborn in the family that was just like Mr. Everything, Miss Everything? I was in this small group in our church a couple of years ago where this kid was telling us, we called him the boy wonder because he just seemed like everything he did was perfect, and he was the older brother in his family. He told us that he went to a Christian school and they gave him an award at the end of high school. They named him Christian of the Year, which I thought, that is a terrible idea. No one needs the label Christian of the Year. But this guy was the most older brother person that I had ever met, and I asked him about his younger siblings, and he was like, yeah, life's been a little more challenging for them. And I'm like, I bet it has been, because they look at you and think, well, if that's what it's going to take, I can't do that. And I'm sure this younger brother felt that way. He probably was bored and probably wanted to go have fun. He probably felt like, I can't make it on the straight and narrow. He probably looked at the older brother and thought, well, I can't ever be that, so I'm just going to go and do me. And that's what he did. And tragically, sadly, somewhere along the way, his view of his dad became warped. That he didn't see his dad for who his dad really was. That somewhere along the way, he just thought, well, my dad's not going to love me unless I'm like my older brother. Or my dad's not going to love me unless I'm just like right down the middle doing everything right, and I just don't know that I can handle that. And without a proper view of God, of course, we would run. And what's worse is when we run and we're away, and all we have to do is turn around and come home, but we just choose not to because of what we think God might say or what we think God might do. And in this case, the case of this younger brother, there's this little line in Luke 15:17 that I just love, this little phrase that says, when he came to his senses. Isn't that beautiful? That somewhere along the way, while he's out there feeding the pigs, looking at the pigs slop and just being filled with envy that he couldn't eat it himself, daydreaming about what life was like back at his dad's house, he comes to his senses. It hits him. What am I doing? What has my dad ever done that's made me think I couldn't come home? And so he decides, I'm going to go home. But even still, we see this speech that he recites. He tells himself this speech that I'm going to say. And inside the speech, you see all of these misconceptions of what his dad's going to say or what his dad's going to do. He says, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. And so I guess I'll set out and I'll go back to my father and I'll say to him, look at the speech that he says. This is the one he's rehearsing on the way back home. Some of you have had a wild night out and you were coming back home to face your spouse and you knew you were going to have this speech ready as well, right? Here's his speech. He says, I'll say to him, well, Father, I have sinned against heaven and I'll sin against you. And then I want to give you three things that we notice on why he was afraid to come back home that's tucked in the middle of this speech. Reason number one is because maybe he's going to be mad and I don't want to face his anger. So he immediately says, Father, I've sinned against you and I've sinned against heaven, which is actually true. And that's really a good place to start. But I would imagine that in his mind, he thought he's going to be mad and I don't want to face his anger, so maybe I shouldn't go back home. So he's rehearsing the speech. Father, I've sinned against heaven, I've sinned against you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Reason number two as to why maybe he was thinking, my dad's going to be too mad, is maybe he was thinking it's too late, I'm too far gone. I've done too much. I'm no longer worthy. I was once worthy, but now I've done too much and I'm too far gone. I can't. Father, I've sinned against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. He probably thought, I've got to work my way back in, and that would be exhausting. You ever feel that way? You think, I got to work my way back in. I have dug myself such a hole, such a ditch, and the only way to get out of it is to work my way back to God, and that's going to be exhausting. I don't know that I want to do all of that. But his father didn't respond the way he thought his father would respond. Luke 15, verse 20. So he gets up and he goes to his father. And there's this little phrase, look at this. But while he was still a long way off, while the father was still a long way off, while the son was still a long way off, the father, I guess he was waiting for him. Because it says that his father saw him and was filled with anger for him. Is that what it says? His father saw him and was filled with fury. His father saw him and was filled with contempt. His father saw him and was irritated. Who does he think he is? His father saw him and he was embarrassed of him. This is not the way I raised you. This is not the kind of kid that we brought you up to be. No. While he was still a long way off, the father saw him and was filled with compassion. This is the father. This is the father's heart. Not angry, not irritated. He's filled with compassion. And so he runs out to his son. And he throws his arm around him and kisses him. Now, I don't know how many of you are clean freaks, you know. I wouldn't necessarily consider myself a clean freak, but I was raised by one. My mom won't take her shoes off in hotels. She won't sit on a hotel bed. I mean, she's just everything's got to be very clean. And so my first thought when I heard this is I thought, I don't know that my mom would have hugged me if I'd have come back from feeding pigs, you know. I don't know that my dad would have hugged me if I'd just come back from feeding pigs, but not this father. This father was not afraid of the mess. This father was not put off by the odor. No, this father was in love with the son and was trying to communicate something to the son. So here he goes on his speech. He gets his speech ready. He says, Father, I've sinned against heaven. I've sinned against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And notice, he doesn't get to finish the speech. You remember what other line he had? He was going to say, make me like one of your hired servants. But I guess the father cuts him off in the middle of his speech. He's like, enough with the speech. The father looks around and he goes, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger, like Beyonce. Put a ring on it. You familiar with the song? Put some sandals on his feet. Bring out the fattened calf and kill it. And let's have a feast and let's celebrate. And this is the line, for this son of mine was dead, and he's alive again. He was lost, and he's found. So they began to celebrate. They began to celebrate. They began to party. Now, we all know if we're going to spend time talking about the older brother, this made the older brother grumpy. But he was the only one. Everyone else is going, well, we're taking our cues from the dad. What's the father doing? Well, the father's out there on the dance floor. Should he be out there? Is this good for him? Has anybody checked his blood pressure lately? Oh, good luck trying to talk him out of it. He's so excited his son's back. He's out there dancing. This dad, he's out there on the dance floor because he's just grateful that his son, who was dead, is now alive. His son, who was lost, is now found. See, why did the son come to his senses? Because I guess he finally realized that the dad was not like he thought he was going to be. That the dad wasn't going to respond like he thought he was going to respond. But even still, he still had a speech ready. The father cuts him off in the middle of the speech and says, no, get that out of here. I don't want to hear any of that. We can talk about that later, but as for now, I just want you to know, I saw you when you were a long way away, and my heart was going crazy because I have so much love and so much compassion for you. And that is the heart of a perfect father. You want to know what God is really like? That is what God is really like. Is God mad at you? No. He loves you. He has compassion for you. Now, my father-in-law that day was mad at me. That was real. And what was worse is that night, I remember laying in bed. I couldn't sleep. I was so frustrated at myself. I thought, I got to figure out how to go get him a new one, I guess. I don't know. Is that spoiling him to go get him another one? But I'm the one who lost it. And I was like, man, why do they create these things this way that it was so hard to fly? I'm like, surely I'm not the only one who's ever done this, I'm an idiot, but I'm not like, the only idiot in the world. There's others. And so I start Googling stuff about this drone. And I found this little instructional video that I watched. And the video said, should your drone ever get to the point where it's flying away, the button on the very top is called the home button. And all you have to do is hold down the home button and it will return to the controller. And I thought, well, that would have been good to know yesterday, but it's too late now. But as I was thinking about this prodigal son story, I just thought, how beautiful is that God is such a loving, compassionate father that he gives us a home button. He says, all you have to do is press the home button. All you have to do is just turn around. All you have to do is just turn around and start walking back. And as soon as you turn around and start walking back, I'll see you. And I'm going to run out, not to give it to you, and not to light you up, but just to love you, to put my arms around you, and to tell you that you're mine. And you were mine when you were here, and you were mine when you were lost, but now that you're found, we're going to celebrate. So what will you find? What will you find in God if you decide to come back home? What will you find? You won't find a father that's sitting there shaking his fist, shaking his finger, telling you, I told you so, how dare you know. You'll find a father who's full of love, who's full of compassion, who says, I just want you. I want you to live life in a healthy way. I want you to make decisions that are good for you, that are good for others, that are good for your future. So come on back. Come on back. For those of you that feel like you're in a place where you've run away, come on back. For those of you that are even thinking about, should I? You don't even have to. Just turn around. God he has this reciprocal nature to him. There's this passage in James where it says, if you draw near to him, what will he do to you? He'll draw near to you. If you return to him, what will he do to you? He'll return to you. If you seek him, what will you find? You'll find him. All you have to do is turn around. All you have to do is come home. So that's the big message of the day. It's real simple, I get it, and it might not be for everyone, but for somebody, this is for you. Maybe you're watching online today, and this is for you. Come back home. Come back home. He loves you. He's for you. You're his. He's got something good for you. Just come back home. Heavenly Father, I just trust that in whatever way that will play itself out, that God, that somebody today will turn around. God, somebody today will decide, I'm coming back home. God is not who I thought he was. He's not mad at me. He's not angry at me. He's not ready to say, I told you so. God is in love with me because he's good and he's perfect, and that is who he is. And we try to project all of our human nature on him, but he is not like other people. His love is not conditional. His love is unconditional. And all we have to do is turn around, press the home button, come back home. God, every one of us in different ways is running in our heart. We're running away, and I just pray that we would run back to you. As we start to get you in a clear view, a great picture, a perfect picture of who you are, we would come back home. We pray all this in Jesus' name.